The school administrator sounded completely exhausted when she told me my daughter had been waiting in the front office for 4 hours. I let out a confused laugh and told her she had the wrong number because I do not have a daughter. I am 29 years old, strictly single, and entirely focused on my career. The woman on the other end of the line did not find it funny. She read my full legal name, my exact home address, and my social security number back to me, threatening to call Child Protective Services if I did not arrive in 20 minutes. I dropped everything and drove there completely unaware that stepping into that school office would uncover a betrayal so deep it would force me to destroy my own family to protect an innocent child. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust broken by the people who were supposed to protect you. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room of my downtown Atlanta office. As the founder and lead developer of my own urban planning firm, I was in the middle of negotiating the final terms for a massive commercial revitalization project. It was the kind of contract that took years of grinding, networking, and proving myself in a highly competitive industry to even get in the room. I had sacrificed holidays, weekends, and countless hours of sleep to build my business from nothing. My phone had been buzzing relentlessly on the mahogany table, disrupting the flow of the meeting. Normally, I would ignore it, but the caller ID showed Oak Ridge Elementary, a highly rated and extremely exclusive school in the affluent neighborhood where I had recently purchased my luxury condo. I excused myself, stepping out into the quiet hallway to take the call. A woman identifying herself as Principal Davis spoke with a sharp, accusatory tone. She informed me that my daughter Maya was sitting in a plastic chair in the main office crying because everyone else had gone home hours ago. I politely explained there was a massive misunderstanding. I told her I was Keisha Williams, an urban developer, not a mother. Principal Davis cut me off with an aggressive sigh, clearly believing I was a deadbeat parent trying to avoid responsibility. She rigidly stated that she was looking directly at the emergency contact sheet and enrollment file. She read my date of birth, my private cell phone number, the exact unit number of my secure building, and then, terrifyingly, my social security number. She told me that if I did not walk through their doors within 20 minutes, she would hand Maya over to the authorities for severe child neglect. My blood ran cold. Maya was my 7-year-old niece, the daughter of my older sister Chloe and her husband Preston. Panic and confusion warred in my chest as I scrambled back into the conference room, hastily apologized to my investors, and grabbed my coat. The drive to Oak Ridge Elementary took 15 agonizing minutes, during which my mind raced through every possible scenario. Chloe was the undisputed golden child of our family. She had always been the center of our parents' universe, pampered and praised simply for existing. She married Preston, a white man with arrogant manners and a supposed pedigree who always treated me with a thinly veiled condescension. They projected an image of absolute perfection, boasting about their lavish lifestyle at every family gathering, while looking down on my relentless work ethic. My parents, Vernon and Beatrice, ate it up constantly, reminding me that I should strive to build a traditional, successful family like my sister, instead of working my life away. Yet beneath their perfectly curated social media presence, I knew things were not as they seemed. Chloe and Preston were always complaining about the cost of living, always dropping subtle hints about needing temporary loans that they never repaid. I had distanced myself from their toxic entitlement years ago, choosing peace and financial independence over their endless drama. But how did Maya end up enrolled at a school in my district, and why was my highly confidential personal information in her file? I pulled into the pristine parking lot of Oak Ridge Elementary, my tires screeching slightly as I parked in the visitor loading zone. The campus was immaculate, practically radiating wealth and exclusivity, entirely different from the struggling public school district where Chloe and Preston actually lived. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and hurried into the main office. The sight that greeted me made my heart ache. Maya was sitting alone on a hard plastic chair near the reception desk. She looked incredibly small, her legs dangling without touching the floor. Her clothes looked unwashed, and she was clutching a worn-out backpack to her chest. She looked terrified, hungry, and utterly exhausted. When she saw me, her eyes welled up with tears, but she did not run to me. She just shrank back into the chair as if she expected to be reprimanded. Principal Davis emerged from her office, her face a mask of stern disapproval. She did not offer a greeting. Instead, she marched over to the front counter and slapped a thick manila folder down on the polished surface. She told me that this was completely unacceptable behavior and that my daughter had been waiting without a snack or a word from me since the final bell rang. I stepped forward, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and protective instinct. I told her again that Maya was my niece, not my daughter. The principal crossed her arms, clearly out of patience, and slid the open file across the counter toward me. I looked down at the documents and the breath left my lungs. Sitting right on top was a birth certificate. It looked entirely official, but it had been doctored. My name was listed cleanly and clearly on the line for the biological mother. Beneath it was a recent utility bill from my electricity provider, perfectly manipulated to show my name and address as proof of residency for the school district. Attached to the back was a notarized guardianship affidavit, bearing a signature that looked chillingly identical to my own. My sister and her husband had not just used my address to sneak their child into a better school. They had meticulously committed severe identity fraud, legally binding me to their child while erasing themselves from the paperwork to avoid paying the exorbitant out-of-district tuition fees. They had stolen my clean record, my address, and my identity to use as their personal safety net, leaving me legally responsible for a child they could not even bother to pick up on time. I stood there staring at the forged documents, the magnitude of the betrayal sinking in. They had weaponized my hard-earned stability. Before I could fully process the reality of the felonies sitting on the desk in front of me, or demand that the principal call the police to report the forgery, a loud commotion erupted in the hallway. The heavy office doors burst open, slamming hard against the wall stops. Chloe and Preston rushed into the room, bringing with them a chaotic, frantic energy that instantly sucked the air out of the space. They were a mess. Chloe was wearing expensive designer clothes that looked hopelessly disheveled, and Preston stumbled slightly as he walked, his normally perfect hair standing up at odd angles. The moment they entered, the distinct, pungent smell of day drinking and desperation hit my nose. They had clearly spent the afternoon at some upscale bar while their daughter sat abandoned and hungry in a school office. The sheer audacity of their arrival left me speechless for a fraction of a second. Maya flinched visibly when her parents walked in, a tiny, heartbreaking reaction that told me everything I needed to know about her life behind closed doors. Chloe did not even look at her own daughter. She did not rush over to comfort the crying 7-year-old or ask if she was okay. Instead, her eyes locked onto me wide with a frantic, aggressive panic. Preston trailed closely behind her, his face flushed red, trying to maintain a facade of arrogant control that was slipping by the second. They had been caught, and they knew it. But instead of showing any remorse or shame for abandoning their child and stealing my identity, they looked at me as if I was the one who had caused this massive inconvenience. The utter lack of guilt in my sister's eyes was the final breaking point. The illusion of our family was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the toxic, parasitic reality they had been hiding all along. The storm had just broken, and I was standing right in the center of it. Chloe did not even glance at Maya. She marched straight toward me, the heavy scent of stale mimosa and desperately applied perfume wafting off her. Before I could take a defensive step back, her hand shot out. Her long acrylic nails dug sharply into my forearm, pinching the skin through the fabric of my tailored blazer. She gripped me with a frantic, aggressive strength that betrayed her absolute panic. "Just tell them you got your work schedule mixed up, Keisha," she muttered, her voice a frantic and breathy hiss, meant only for my ears. "Play along or they will take her away." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer audacity of her demand. She had abandoned her 7-year-old daughter for 4 consecutive hours, forged federal documents, and stolen my identity. Yet she was treating me like an uncooperative employee who was purposefully ruining her afternoon. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, then back up to her bloodshot eyes. I quietly told her to let go of me before I made this much worse for her. Preston immediately stepped between us, not to defend me, but to run damage control. He smoothed down his wrinkled designer polo shirt and turned his attention to Principal Davis. Preston had always known how to weaponize his privilege. Even smelling like a distillery on a Tuesday afternoon, he puffed out his chest and adopted that smooth, arrogant tone he used whenever he wanted to bypass the rules. He flashed a bright, practiced smile that completely ignored the severity of the situation. "Principal Davis, I sincerely apologize for the confusion," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is just a simple paperwork misunderstanding among family. You know how chaotic modern scheduling can be. Keisha here simply forgot it was her day for carpool duty, and my wife and I were tied up in emergency meetings. It is a harmless clerical error." A harmless clerical error. He was actually standing in a school office trying to charm a frantic school administrator into ignoring a forged birth certificate and a fake utility bill. He thought he could just smile his way out of multiple felonies. Principal Davis did not look charmed in the slightest. Her posture remained rigid, her hands flat on the desk. Her eyes darted between Preston's forced, overly confident smile and the terrified child sitting just a few feet away. She was not buying a single word of his ridiculous story. Chloe leaned in close to me again, sensing that Preston's usual manipulative tactics were failing to diffuse the tension in the room. Her breath was hot against my neck as she whispered with pure, venomous entitlement. "You owe me this, Keisha. You selfishly refused to pay for our destination wedding last year. The absolute least you can do is let Maya use your address so she can go to a decent school. Do not be a bitter spinster and ruin my life just because you have no family of your own." The sheer weight of her delusion settled over me like a heavy blanket. She actually believed I owed her my clean financial record and my legal identity because I had chosen not to drain my business accounts to fund her $50,000 beach wedding in Cabo. For years, I had worked 80-hour weeks building my urban planning firm, securing commercial real estate contracts, and creating a highly stable life for myself. Chloe had spent those exact same years bouncing between expensive hobbies, relying on our parents to constantly fund a lifestyle she and Preston could not actually afford. Now she was using her own daughter as a pawn to maintain a facade of wealth in a school district they had no business being in. I looked over at Maya. The little girl had pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible in the hard plastic chair. She was shaking. The most heartbreaking part was that she did not run to her mother when Chloe walked in. She did not reach out for her father to seek comfort. She just stared at the floor, bracing herself for whatever chaos was about to erupt. That specific observation broke whatever lingering sense of sisterly obligation I had left inside my heart. This was no longer about protecting Chloe from embarrassment or keeping the peace for the sake of our parents. This was about a neglected, hungry child being used as a prop by two people who cared significantly more about affluent zip codes than their own daughter's well-being. I forcefully yanked my arm out of Chloe's grip. The sudden movement made her stumble backward into Preston, knocking them both off balance. I turned my back on my sister and looked directly at Principal Davis. My voice was loud, steady, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. "Principal Davis, I am not Maya's mother. I did not sign those documents. I have never seen that birth certificate in my life, and I do not reside with these people. I want you to call the police right now because I am pressing full criminal charges for identity fraud and forgery against both of them." The entire office went dead silent. The school secretary at the front desk stopped typing on her keyboard. Principal Davis's eyes widened, and she immediately reached for the desk phone without a second of hesitation. Preston's arrogant smile vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He took a heavy step toward me, raising his hands, his voice dropping its charming cadence and taking on a dark, threatening edge. He told me I was making a massive mistake and that I was going to destroy their lives over nothing. Before Preston could close the distance between us, the heavy office doors swung open one more time. My mother Beatrice stormed into the room. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, looking exactly like the status-obsessed matriarch she had always been. She must have been the one Chloe called in a panic when the school first threatened to contact the authorities. Beatrice did not look at the principal. She did not look at Preston. She did not even glance at her 7-year-old granddaughter, who was still trembling in the corner of the room. She bypassed absolutely everyone in the office and marched straight up to me. Without a single word of greeting or hesitation, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly against the linoleum walls of the school office. My cheek burned instantly, the stinging pain radiating up to my eye, but I did not fall. I stood my ground, staring down at the woman who had just physically assaulted her own daughter in front of an audience of educators, all to protect a criminal. The secretary gasped, and Principal Davis immediately dialed the authorities. "How dare you try to send your sister to jail over a piece of paper?" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, contained rage. "You selfish, vindictive girl. Chloe is a mother trying to do what is best for her child. Fix this right now or you are dead to us." The flashing lights of the patrol cars reflecting off the glass doors of Oak Ridge Elementary felt entirely surreal. Within minutes of Principal Davis making that call, the local police had arrived to escort all of us to the precinct. I did not rub my cheek where my mother had struck me. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing my physical pain, just as I refused to back down when the officers separated us into different interrogation rooms. The sterile, windowless room I was placed in smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I sat across the metal table from two detectives, calmly explaining that my sister and her husband had forged federal and state documents to enroll their daughter in my school district. I expected it to be an open and shut case of identity theft. I underestimated the sheer terrifying brilliance of my family's ability to lie. The detectives left me alone for what felt like an eternity before returning with a deeply skeptical energy. They opened the door and allowed Preston and my mother to step inside, effectively turning the interrogation into a mediated family dispute. Preston had completely dropped the panicked, aggressive demeanor he displayed at the school. In its place was the polished, articulate, and deeply concerned persona of a successful corporate husband. He used his crisp suit and his undeniable white privilege to command the room, speaking to the detectives man to man. His voice was dripping with fake sympathy as he spun a masterful, devastating narrative. Preston looked at the officers with a heavy sigh and explained that I was an overworked, lonely woman who had been slowly spiraling out of control. He claimed that because my business consumed my entire life and I had no husband or children of my own, Chloe, and he had graciously allowed me to take in Maya temporarily. According to his fabricated story, they were doing massive renovations on their home and thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for me to foster a maternal bond with my niece. He told the police that I had begged to take Maya, but the stress of playing mother had clearly triggered a psychotic break. He actually used the words mentally unstable and jealous spinster, shaking his head, as if my supposed descent into madness was a tragic burden his family had been quietly carrying for years. Before I could even defend myself against the absolute absurdity of his claims, my mother stepped perfectly into her role. Beatrice clutched her designer handbag to her chest, her eyes welling up with meticulously timed tears. She looked at the detectives with the heartbroken expression of a mother watching her child unravel. She told them I had been like this since college, always trying to ruin my sister's shine out of deep-seated jealousy. She actually brought up the time I had nearly missed graduation because Chloe stole my tuition money to fund a spring break trip. But in my mother's twisted retelling to the police, she claimed I had fabricated that entire theft simply because I could not handle the academic pressure and wanted to frame my sister for my own failures. The ease with which they rewrote our family history right in front of me was chilling. They were painting me as a delusional, bitter woman who was now rejecting a child I had supposedly begged to care for. I kept my voice completely steady as I slid my pristine state identification, my business cards, and my clean financial records across the metal table. I demanded that the detectives run a full background check on me, insisting that my immaculate record would speak for itself. One of the officers actually seemed to listen, his expression shifting toward me with a glimmer of understanding. But Preston was already prepared. With a smooth, practiced motion, he pulled a thick, embossed folder from his leather briefcase and slid it directly over my identification cards. It was a notarized temporary guardianship affidavit. Preston explained with absolute calm that because I had insisted on taking Maya for the semester, I had also demanded legal standing to handle her school pickups and medical emergencies. The document was an absolute masterpiece of fraud. The state seal looked authentic. The notary stamp was perfectly placed, and the signature at the bottom was a flawless, identical match to my own handwriting. I stared at the forgery, my heart hammering against my ribs. I forcefully told the detectives that the document was entirely fake, that Preston had likely lifted my signature from old business contracts we had co-signed years ago. But the police were paralyzed. They were looking at two well-dressed, articulate parties holding completely conflicting paperwork. To them, the forgery turned a clear criminal act into a messy, complicated civil dispute. They did not want to make an arrest when they could not immediately verify who was telling the truth. However, because the situation involved a minor allegations of neglect and active hostility, the police had no choice but to involve Child Protective Services. A sharp-eyed social worker named Ms. Higgins arrived at the precinct shortly after. The stakes instantly skyrocketed. This was no longer just about forged school enrollment or my stolen identity. A 7-year-old child was sitting in a holding room down the hall, and the state was now deciding her fate. Ms. Higgins began interviewing everyone, her gaze calculating and strictly professional. This was exactly the moment Chloe and Preston's supreme arrogance became their ultimate downfall. They were so used to charming their way out of consequences that they forgot they were not at a country club. When Ms. Higgins leaned in close to ask Preston about the timeline of the supposed home renovations, she paused. Her nose wrinkled slightly. Preston had tried to mask it with a breath mint, but the sour, unmistakable scent of bourbon still clung to his breath. Chloe, emboldened by the belief that they were winning, began to speak over her husband, but she slurred her words slightly, her voice a pitch too loud for the small interrogation room. They had spent the entire afternoon drinking, while their daughter sat abandoned, and the social worker noticed every single detail. Meanwhile, I sat straight in my chair, stone-cold sober, maintaining direct eye contact and answering every question with concise, factual clarity. Ms. Higgins excused herself to make a few phone calls and review the preliminary background checks the police had finally run. When she returned 15 minutes later, the dynamic in the room shifted instantly. My background check had come back completely flawless. No criminal history, no erratic behavior, just a solid record of a successful business owner. Chloe and Preston, on the other hand, had recently flagged financial issues that the system was just beginning to catch. Ms. Higgins stood at the head of the table and made a sudden, legally binding decision that drained the color completely out of my sister's face. She stated that due to the biological parents appearing visibly intoxicated and hostile, and given the presence of a notarized document naming me as the legal guardian, Maya would not be going home with Chloe and Preston. Instead, CPS was granting me emergency temporary custody of Maya for 72 hours. During this period, a full investigation into the fraud and neglect allegations would commence. She then turned to Preston and Chloe, warning them in a voice like steel that they were to have absolutely no contact with me or Maya, and that any attempt to approach my home would result in their immediate arrest. The silence lasted for exactly 1 second before Chloe completely lost her mind. She lunged forward, her pristine facade shattering into sheer hysteria. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was kidnapping her child. She hurled obscenities, thrashing wildly, as Preston had to physically wrap his arms around her waist to drag her back. My mother shrieked at the social worker, demanding to speak to a supervisor, threatening to sue the entire police department for tearing a loving mother away from her baby. The officers immediately stepped in, hands resting on their utility belts, ordering them to step back and calm down, or face a night in a holding cell. I did not stay to watch the rest of their pathetic meltdown. I thanked the social worker, picked up my purse, and walked out of the interrogation room. I found Maya in the lobby sitting quietly with a female officer who was offering her a juice box. The little girl looked up at me, her eyes exhausted and searching for any sign of safety. I gently took her hand, promising her that everything was going to be all right, and walked out of the precinct into the cool evening air. I had won the battle in that room, securing an innocent child away from toxic monsters. But as I strapped Maya into my car and drove toward the sanctuary of my secure condo, I had absolutely no idea that my family had already set a much deeper, far more devastating trap waiting for me in the dark. The drive from the precinct to my downtown condo was completely silent. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror to watch Maya. She was clutching her worn backpack tightly to her chest, her small eyes darting around as if she expected the police to chase us down at any moment. The adrenaline that had carried me through the brutal confrontation with my mother and the social worker was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold and sharp clarity. I pulled into the secure underground garage of my building, swiped my key fob, and guided Maya toward the private elevator. My home is my sanctuary. It is a sprawling, high-floor unit with expansive windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. It represents years of late nights, skipped vacations, and relentless ambition. As we stepped inside, the stark contrast between my quiet, immaculate space and the chaotic, alcohol-soaked environment Maya had just been dragged from hit me incredibly hard. I took her coat, noting with a heavy heart how thin and cheap the fabric was for the dropping temperature outside. I knelt down to her eye level, told her she was entirely safe here, and asked if she was hungry. She gave a tiny, hesitant nod. I went straight to the kitchen and quickly put together a warm bowl of macaroni and cheese, sliced some fresh fruit, and poured a large glass of milk. Maya sat at my quartz kitchen island, eating with a desperate, rapid intensity that broke my heart all over again. I sat across from her, keeping my voice soft and steady, so I would not startle her. I asked her how long she had been waiting at the school before the principal finally called me. She swallowed hard, avoiding my eyes, and mumbled that her dad told her to wait by the office until he finished his important meeting. But then she stopped, her lower lip trembling uncontrollably. She quietly confessed that her parents fight all the time. She said they yell about money, throw things at the walls, and sometimes when the house gets locked, they have to sleep in the back of her dad's car. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Sleeping in the car. Preston and Chloe projected an image of absolute untouchable wealth to our entire family. They constantly bragged about luxury vacations, designer clothes, and exclusive country club memberships. My mother practically worshipped the ground they walked on because of their supposed social status. Why on earth would they be locked out of their house and sleeping in a vehicle? The forged school documents and the fake guardianship papers I had just seen at the police precinct suddenly took on a much darker, far more desperate context. This was not just about getting Maya into a better school district to keep up appearances. They were actively hiding something massive, and they were using my name to do it. I set Maya up in the guest bedroom with a warm blanket and put on a cartoon to keep her distracted and comfortable. Once I was sure she was completely safe, I walked straight into my home office and locked the door behind me. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up my secure financial dashboard. If Preston had the audacity and the skill to forge my signature on state guardianship documents, I needed to know exactly how deep his access to my personal information went. I took a deep breath and ran a comprehensive deep pull on my personal and business credit reports. The loading screen spun for what felt like an eternity, and then the results populated on my monitor. I felt the breath get completely knocked out of my lungs. The pristine financial record I had meticulously maintained for the last decade was gone. In its place was an absolute war zone of debt. I scrolled down the page, my eyes widening in pure horror. There were 3 separate credit cards opened in my name over the last 8 months. All of them were completely maxed out to the tune of $45,000. I clicked into the transaction histories and saw charges for high-end steakhouses, luxury boutique shopping, and expensive resort stays. They were funding their entire fake lifestyle using my credit. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. My eyes scanned further down the screen and locked onto a catastrophic figure that made my stomach churn. There was an active high-yield business loan taken out under the exact legal name of my urban planning firm. The principal amount was $300,000. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I clicked into the loan details to find the origination date was exactly 4 months ago. The funds had been fully dispersed, but not a single repayment had been made. The contact email on the account was a clever variation of my own name, but the recovery phone number belonged directly to Preston. They had not just stolen my identity to enroll their child in school. They had systematically hijacked my entire financial existence to fund their lavish lifestyle while secretly living out of their car. I was reaching for my phone to call the fraud department of my bank when a sudden heavy knock at my front door shattered the silence of my condo. I froze in my chair. The concierge downstairs was supposed to announce all visitors before granting them access to the residential floors. I walked out of my office down the hallway and checked the security monitor mounted by the entryway. Standing in the corridor was a man I did not recognize holding a thick manila envelope. I cautiously opened the door, keeping the heavy security chain firmly engaged. The man looked at me, verified my unit number, and asked if I was Keisha Williams. When I confirmed my identity, he slid the thick envelope through the gap in the door, stated in a bored tone that I had been officially served, and walked away down the hall without another word. I closed the door, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I tore open the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The header at the top of the first page read, as a formal notice of default and impending asset seizure. I read through the dense legal jargon, my blood turning to absolute ice. Preston had not just taken out a massive business loan under my firm's name. He had used the equity of my downtown luxury condo as the primary collateral for a failing shell company he had registered under my identity. He knew his own financial empire was collapsing. He knew they were facing absolute ruin. So he deliberately orchestrated a scheme to tie all of his toxic, fraudulent debt directly to my assets. He and Chloe were not just stealing from me. They were actively framing me to take the complete legal and financial fall for their impending bankruptcy. I stared at the notice of default, the heavy legal paper feeling like lead in my hands. The shock that had paralyzed me moments ago quickly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. Preston actually believed he could steal my home, ruin my immaculate credit, and use me as a human shield for his own catastrophic financial failures. He expected me to crumble, to cry, and to surrender. I refused to shed a single tear over his cowardice. I set the documents down on my kitchen island, checked the guest room to ensure Maya was still sleeping peacefully, and reached for my phone. It was past midnight, but I knew exactly who to call. I dialed Dion. Dion was not just a certified public accountant. He was a ruthless, top-tier forensic auditor who specialized in unraveling complex corporate fraud for high-net-worth commercial real estate firms. He was notoriously expensive, painfully blunt, and absolutely brilliant. When he answered on the third ring, his voice was sharp and alert. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the entire situation in precise detail, from the forged guardianship papers to the maxed-out credit cards and the fraudulent $300,000 business loan taken out against my condo. Dion did not gasp or offer useless sympathy. He simply asked for my login credentials and told me he would have a preliminary mapping of the fraud by sunrise. Within hours, while the rest of the city slept, Dion began hunting. He methodically bypassed the standard bank dispute protocols and went straight for the digital footprint. He started tracing the IP addresses associated with every single loan application, every digital signature, and every credit card transaction. By dawn, he had already confirmed what I suspected. The IP addresses did not match my secure home network or my office. They traced directly back to Preston and Chloe's supposedly under renovation suburban house, as well as the guest Wi-Fi of Preston's exclusive country club. Dion was building a bulletproof digital cage around my brother-in-law, one keystroke at a time. I felt a brief surge of triumph as the sun rose over the Atlanta skyline. I believed I was gaining the upper hand. But I had underestimated the desperate cornered animal mentality of my family. Preston and Chloe realized their school zone fraud had spectacularly imploded, and that Child Protective Services was currently investigating them. They knew I would find the financial rot they had planted under my name. So instead of retreating, they decided to strike first and completely cut off my resources. They wanted to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that no one would believe me when I eventually went to the authorities about the debt. Preston knew exactly how to hit me where it would cause the most devastating damage. For years, he had used his inherited country club membership to rub elbows with the city's elite, pretending to be a successful corporate titan while secretly drowning in debt. Now he weaponized that exact same network against me. Using an encrypted, untraceable email address, Preston crafted a highly sophisticated and deeply damaging message. He posed as a concerned whistleblower from within my own urban planning firm. The email was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. It claimed that I was currently the subject of an active multi-agency federal investigation for massive embezzlement, wire fraud, and the gross mismanagement of investor funds. It suggested that I was using client capital to fund an unstable, lavish personal lifestyle, and warned that any firm doing business with me was at immediate risk of having their assets frozen by federal authorities. Preston did not just send this malicious fabrication to a few random contacts. He deliberately mass emailed it to my entire professional network. He targeted my top real estate investors, the commercial developers I had spent the last 7 years cultivating, and the city planners who approved my zoning permits. He launched a nuclear strike on the professional reputation I had sacrificed everything to build. I had absolutely no idea the smear campaign had been launched until 10 o'clock that morning. I had managed to get Maya dressed and settled with a coloring book and a fresh breakfast in my living room before stepping into my home office for a scheduled video conference. This was supposed to be a celebratory call. I had spent the last 8 months negotiating a massive $2 million commercial redevelopment contract with a syndicate of out-of-state investors. The paperwork was finalized, the legal teams had reviewed the terms, and we were simply supposed to be verbalizing our final commitments before signing. I logged into the virtual meeting room with a confident, practiced smile. That smile vanished the second the investors' cameras flickered on. The atmosphere in the digital room was freezing cold. There was no casual banter, no congratulations on the impending deal. The lead investor, a man who had praised my vision just 2 days prior, looked at me with undisguised suspicion and immediate hostility. He did not bother with a polite introduction. He simply stated that they had received some deeply disturbing correspondence regarding the financial integrity of my firm. My stomach plummeted. I kept my posture rigid and my voice professional, asking him to clarify the nature of these concerns. He read Preston's fabricated whistleblower email out loud, word for word. I listened in absolute horror as the accusations of federal investigations and embezzlement filled the silence of my office. I immediately went into damage control mode. I spoke with absolute authority, assuring the investors that these claims were completely baseless and legally actionable defamation. I offered to open my firm's books to their independent auditors right that very second, promising total transparency to prove my financial health. I explained that I was the victim of a targeted, malicious attack and that I had already retained forensic counsel to trace the source. But in the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, perception is reality and panic is highly contagious. The investors did not care about my promises of transparency or my explanations of defamation. The mere whisper of federal investigations and frozen assets was enough to make them bolt. The lead investor shook his head, his expression closed off and final. He stated that their firm could not assume the level of risk associated with these allegations, regardless of their validity. He wished me luck resolving my personal matters, and one by one the investors abruptly disconnected from the call. I sat staring at the black screen of my monitor, the silence of my office pressing heavily against my ears. In less than 10 minutes, I had watched a $2 million contract, the absolute crown jewel of my career, evaporate into thin air. Preston had successfully torpedoed my livelihood while I was busy protecting his neglected daughter. Before the sheer magnitude of the professional catastrophe could fully settle over me, my cell phone vibrated violently against the surface of my mahogany desk. I looked down at the glowing screen, expecting an apologetic text from one of the junior investors, or perhaps an urgent update from Dion. Instead, the notification showed a message from my father, Vernon. I stared at the words, the sheer audacity of the command making the blood rush loudly in my ears. The text read exactly as follows: "Family dinner tonight at the Capitol Grill. Bring Maya. We are ending this nonsense. Do not embarrass us." The heavy oak doors of the Capitol Grill swung open, welcoming us into a world of dim lighting, polished mahogany, and the low, wealthy murmur of corporate Atlanta. I held Maya tightly by the hand. She was wearing a new dress I had bought her earlier that afternoon, her small fingers gripping my palm with desperate strength. Before we stepped toward the host stand, I paused in the foyer. I reached into my leather tote bag, running my thumb over the smooth, metallic edge of a digital audio recorder. I pressed the central button, felt the singular vibration confirming it was active, and left my bag slightly unzipped. Dayon had strictly instructed me to get everything on tape. I was walking into a lion's den, but I was no longer the prey. The hostess led us to a semi-private booth tucked away in the back corner of the restaurant. There they were. Vernon, Beatrice, Chloe, and Preston sat around the crisp white tablecloth, looking like a portrait of absolute affluent perfection. My father, Vernon, was swirling a glass of expensive scotch. Beatrice was casually adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. Preston and Chloe were leaning together, laughing softly at some private joke. It was staggering. Less than 12 hours ago, they had committed multiple felonies, abandoned a child, and deliberately sabotaged a $2 million commercial contract to financially bleed me out. Yet here they sat, sipping vintage wine and acting completely unbothered, wrapped in a terrifying bubble of pure delusion. As we approached the table, Chloe suddenly plastered on a wide, manicured smile and leaned forward. She reached her arms out, cooing Maya's name, playing the role of the devoted, longing mother for the benefit of the surrounding tables. Maya instantly froze. She dropped her gaze to the carpet and stepped behind my legs, using my body as a physical shield. The rejection was immediate and visceral. Chloe's fake smile hardened into a sharp scowl, her hands retreating to her lap. I did not say a word to my sister. I simply guided Maya into the booth, sliding in right beside her to ensure neither Chloe nor Preston could sit too close. Vernon took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch and looked at me with deep disapproval. His gaze swept over Maya, then settled heavily on my face. He used his patriarchal commanding tone, the one he had used my entire life to bend reality to his will. He told me he was glad I had decided to be reasonable and attend the dinner. He stated that the events of the afternoon were an unfortunate overreaction on everyone's part, and that it was time to put family first. Beatrice immediately chimed in, picking at her wedge salad. She sighed dramatically, telling me that I always had a habit of escalating simple misunderstandings into massive, unnecessary spectacles. I sat in complete silence. The waiter approached and I ordered a filet mignon for Maya, asking the kitchen to prepare it, well done, and cut into small pieces. I ordered a glass of sparkling water for myself. I was not going to consume alcohol while navigating an active psychological war zone. Preston smirked, leaning back against the leather upholstery of the booth. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored blazer and adopted a tone of smooth, arrogant condescension. He actually had the audacity to apologize that my business deal had fallen through earlier that morning. He claimed the corporate world was incredibly volatile and that rumors spread quickly when a firm lacked stable leadership. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of his comment almost made me admire his ruthlessness. He was sitting across from me, actively gloating about nuking my livelihood, pretending it was just bad luck. I kept my face entirely neutral. I told Preston that my firm would survive the volatility, and that I was currently working with a top-tier forensic accountant to trace the exact origin of those rumors. For a fraction of a second, Preston's arrogant smile twitched. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes before he quickly masked it by reaching for his wine glass. He knew I was fighting back, but he still severely underestimated how much ammunition I possessed. The dinner arrived. While Maya quietly picked at her food, keeping her head down to avoid her parents, Vernon decided it was time to execute their trap. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, set it down carefully, and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a thick black leather portfolio and unclasped it. He slid a dense stack of legal documents across the table until they rested directly in front of my plate. The pages were covered in sticky notes indicating exactly where I needed to sign and notarize my name. Vernon leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice dropped to a low, serious register, designed to sound like a trusted advisor offering a generous compromise. He explained that Preston and Chloe had found themselves in a temporary liquidity crisis due to some aggressive real estate investments. He pointed to the documents and instructed me to officially assume the $300,000 business loan they had taken out. He stated it as a fact, not a request. He said my urban planning firm generated more than enough capital to cover the monthly payments without causing me any real financial distress. I looked down at the documents, then back up at my father. I asked him why on earth I would assume hundreds of thousands of dollars of fraudulent debt that Preston had illegally secured using my stolen identity. Vernon did not even flinch at the word illegal. He waved his hand dismissively, stating that using family resources was not a crime, but a shared obligation. He then delivered the ultimate justification. Vernon promised me that Preston's family trust fund was scheduled to fully vest next year when Preston turned 40. According to my father, this trust fund contained millions of dollars in generational wealth tied to shipping and logistics companies. Vernon swore on his life that the absolute second the trust fund cleared, Preston would reimburse me for every single penny of the loan plus generous interest. Beatrice leaned in her eyes wide with manufactured urgency. She told me that Preston simply needed to shield his immediate credit score to finalize a massive corporate acquisition. She insisted that if I pressed fraud charges or if I let Child Protective Services continue their investigation, the resulting scandal would freeze Preston's background checks and ruin the family's social standing permanently. Vernon tapped his index finger against the signature line of the contract. He delivered his final absolute ultimatum. He ordered me to sign the papers, drop the CPS nonsense, return Maya to her mother, and protect the family name at all costs. The air in the booth grew incredibly thick. Chloe sat up straight, crossing her arms over her chest, staring at me with a look of entitled expectation. Preston tried to look humble, nodding solemnly as if he were a burdened titan of industry asking a minor favor. They honestly believed this performance was going to work. They believed that by invoking the sacred concept of the family name, I would instantly assume their massive criminal debt and hand a traumatized 7-year-old child right back to her abusers. I did not yell. I did not throw my glass of water in Preston's face. I did not curse at my parents for treating me like a sacrificial lamb. Instead, I calmly picked up my knife and fork. I reached over to Maya's plate and began methodically cutting her steak into smaller, perfect bite-sized pieces. The sharp scrape of the serrated blade against the porcelain plate was the only sound at the table. I made sure every single piece of meat was cut perfectly. I set the knife down, wiped my hands on my napkin, and looked Vernon dead in the eye. My voice was quiet, steady, and sharp enough to slice through bone. "Preston has no trust fund, Dad." The entire table froze. Vernon stopped mid-breath. Beatrice lowered her fork. Chloe's eyes widened in absolute shock. Preston's face drained of every drop of color, turning a sickly ashen gray. I kept my eyes locked on my father, my tone completely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. I explained that my forensic accountant, Dion, had run a comprehensive deep background check on my brother-in-law's entire lineage. I laid the devastating facts out on the table with absolute precision. I told Vernon that Preston was entirely broke. His parents were not wealthy shipping magnates or old money aristocrats. They were middle-class retirees living on a fixed, modest pension in a small town in Ohio. They had never owned a trust fund, a yacht, or a corporate empire. I watched the realization slowly begin to dawn on Vernon's face. The ultimate status-obsessed patriarch was finally understanding that he had been conned. I leaned in just an inch closer, delivering the final, devastating blow. I asked Vernon if he remembered the deeply sophisticated, incredibly wealthy parents Preston had paraded around the country club galas last Christmas, the ones Vernon had spent hours drinking scotch with, bragging about their shared elite status. I let a cold, humorless smile touch the corners of my mouth. I told my father that those people were not Preston's parents. They were local theater actors that Preston had hired for $2,000 a night to successfully con his way into our family's wealth. The silence that fell over the Capitol grill was absolute. For several agonizing seconds, no one dared to breathe. The clinking of expensive silverware and the low, wealthy murmur of the surrounding tables seemed to fade into a vacuum. Preston's mouth opened and closed silently like a landed fish. The polished, arrogant corporate facade he had worn just moments prior melted away, leaving behind the terrified, sweating face of a cornered con artist. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits, as if calculating how quickly he could flee the restaurant. He had absolutely no defense. The truth was sitting bare and undeniable right in the middle of the table. I expected Chloe to turn on him. I expected the sister who had worshipped social status her entire life to scream at the man who had lied about his entire existence. But the sheer depth of my family's delusion was a bottomless pit. Chloe did not look at her husband with disgust. Instead, her eyes narrowed into dark, venomous slits, and she directed every ounce of her pure, unadulterated fury directly at me. She slammed her manicured hands onto the table, leaning forward with a panicked, unhinged energy. She began to hiss her voice, a sharp, screeching whisper, so the neighboring tables would not overhear. Chloe accused me of being a bitter, lonely, jealous woman who was actively trying to destroy her marriage. She claimed that because I had failed to find a man of my own, I had hired someone to fabricate this background check, simply to tear down her happiness. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. Chloe would literally rather believe that her own sister was a criminal mastermind actively fabricating documents than admit the reality that her husband was a penniless fraud. She doubled down, telling me that I was dead to her, that I was a venomous snake trying to poison a perfectly happy family out of pure spite. I watched her unravel with a chilling sense of detachment, but it was my father's reaction that truly solidified the absolute rot at the core of our family. Vernon stared at Preston. The revelation that his favorite elite son-in-law was a broke fraud from Ohio who had hired regional theater actors to play his aristocratic parents should have shattered Vernon's world. My father had built his entire identity on social climbing and country club prestige. Admitting Preston was a con man meant admitting his daughter had married a fake. It meant the other wealthy families at the club would laugh at him. It meant public, devastating humiliation. Vernon looked at Preston's sweating face, then looked down at his glass of scotch. He swirled the amber liquid once, took a slow sip, and completely ignored the bombshell I had just dropped. Vernon tapped his index finger sharply against the signature line of the debt assumption documents he had pushed in front of my plate. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and stated that the origin of Preston's family was completely irrelevant to the current situation. He said the $300,000 business loan was already in my name, so I was going to sign the papers, assume the debt, and make the problem disappear quietly to protect the family from a public scandal. He demanded that I absorb the financial ruin of my sister's husband simply to maintain the illusion that our family was flawless. When I refused to pick up the pen, Vernon escalated the situation with a cruelty that finally broke whatever lingering attachment I had to him. He leaned across the table, the scent of expensive cologne and alcohol rolling off him. His voice dropped into a menacing, completely sociopathic register. He told me that if I did not sign the documents and immediately return Maya to Chloe, he would personally call the chief of police. He reminded me that he played golf with the chief every Sunday. Vernon promised to file an official report, stating that I had abducted my niece, that I was mentally unstable, and that I was holding a child hostage against the will of her loving parents. He threatened to have me arrested for kidnapping, completely destroying my life and my business, all before the dessert menus arrived at the table. He was entirely willing to send his own daughter to a jail cell to protect a con man, simply to avoid a society scandal. The sheer depravity of his threat hung heavily in the air. I looked down at Maya. The 7-year-old had stopped eating entirely. Her small hands were trembling violently as she gripped her linen napkin. She was terrified of these people, and my father was actively using her trauma as a bargaining chip to force me into submission. I did not yell. I did not throw my glass of water in Preston's sweating face. I did not curse at my parents for treating me like a sacrificial lamb for their own egos. I calmly reached over and finished methodically cutting Maya's steak into small, perfect pieces. I set the knife down, wiped my hands on my napkin, and slowly stood up from the leather booth. I reached down and took Maya gently but firmly by the hand, lifting her from her seat and positioning her safely behind my legs. With my free hand, I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out my heavy metal corporate credit card. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter against the fine china, the sound ringing out clearly over the low murmur of the restaurant. I looked directly at Vernon, then at Beatrice, then at Chloe, and finally at Preston. My voice was quiet, steady, and sharp enough to slice through solid bone. "Enjoy the steaks," I told them, keeping my posture absolutely rigid. "It is the last meal I will ever finance for this family." I turned my back on them and walked out of the restaurant, holding Maya close to my side, leaving them sitting in the wreckage of their own toxic lies. I kept my head held high as we exited through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. I handed the valet my ticket, helped Maya into the back seat of my luxury sedan, and locked the doors. The drive back to my condo was incredibly quiet. The streetlights cast long rhythmic shadows across the interior of the car. Maya fell asleep within minutes, the sheer exhaustion of the day's trauma finally pulling her under. I drove in silence, mentally mapping out my next steps. I was prepared to file a massive police report in the morning. I had the audio recording from the dinner safely stored on my phone, capturing Vernon's blackmail and Chloe's unhinged rant. I thought I had survived the worst of it. I thought the battle lines were drawn, and I simply had to execute the legal strategy to clear my name. Then the Bluetooth system in my car blared to life, shattering the quiet of the vehicle. Dion's name flashed urgently across the dashboard screen. I answered the call, expecting a routine update on the loan origination documents we were preparing for the police. But Dion did not sound like his usual cynical, unflappable self. His voice was incredibly tight, rushed, and laced with genuine panic. Dion told me he had dug much deeper into the routing numbers associated with the $300,000 business loan. Preston did not just take the money to pay off his maxed-out credit cards or fund his country club dues. He had pushed the entire sum through a highly sophisticated, deeply obscured maze of offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. My blood turned to absolute ice as Dion explained that those specific routing hubs were actively flagged by international authorities for illicit activities. Preston was laundering money. He had taken toxic, fraudulent funds, mixed them with the loans secured under my firm's name, and washed them offshore to hide them from his impending bankruptcy. The terrifying reality dropped over me like an anvil. Dion warned me that the federal government was already actively monitoring those specific accounts. The FBI and the IRS were currently tracking the flow of that money. And because Preston had orchestrated the entire operation using my urban planning firm's employer identification number and my personal social security number, my name was the only one on the paperwork. Preston was completely insulated behind the digital walls he had built using my identity. Dion's voice cracked through the car speakers, delivering the final, devastating blow. He told me I was no longer just looking at a ruined credit score or a messy civil lawsuit against my family. I was standing directly in the crosshairs of a major federal investigation, and I was facing decades in federal prison. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of my building, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so intensely that my knuckles ached. Federal prison. The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. Preston had not just stolen my impeccable credit rating, he had actively framed me for international money laundering. I told Dion to freeze every single asset he legally could and ended the call. I looked in the rearview mirror at Maya. She was still sleeping soundly in the back seat, completely oblivious to the nuclear fallout raining down on our lives. I carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and carried her upstairs to the guest room, gently pulling the soft duvet over her small shoulders. I had just poured myself a strong cup of black coffee and opened my laptop on the kitchen island when a terrified, piercing scream echoed from down the hall. I dropped the ceramic mug. It shattered against the hardwood floor, splashing hot liquid across my ankles, but I ignored the burning sensation and sprinted to the guest room. Maya was sitting straight up in the center of the bed. Her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated panic, and her small chest heaved as she gasped for air. She was clutching the blankets tightly to her chin. I rushed to her side immediately, wrapping my arms around her trembling frame. She clung to my shirt, her small fingers digging desperately into the fabric. She begged me to check the locks on the front door. She told me to make sure the deadbolts were thrown, whispering the reason with wide, fearful eyes. She said Daddy breaks things when he is mad. The sheer naked terror in her 7-year-old voice made the blood in my veins run absolutely cold. She detailed how Preston would fly into violent, unpredictable rages whenever a credit card was declined or a business deal collapsed. She described him smashing expensive vases against the wall, punching holes in the drywall, and screaming at Chloe while Maya hid silently in the darkness of her closet. She told me Chloe would simply pour another large glass of wine and completely ignore the violence, often yelling at Maya to stop crying and go back to her room because she was giving her a headache. Hearing the raw, unfiltered truth of her daily existence fundamentally altered the chemistry in my brain. The paralyzing fear of a federal indictment completely vanished instantly, replaced by an unshakable, predatory maternal instinct. This was no longer just a financial dispute over a fraudulent loan or a damaged reputation. This was a rescue mission. I held Maya tightly against my chest, gently stroking her hair until her frantic breathing finally slowed to a steady rhythm. I looked her directly in the eyes and made a solemn, unbreakable vow. I promised her that neither Preston nor Chloe would ever be allowed to raise their voice at her again. I promised her she was absolutely safe under my roof, and I promised her I would systematically burn their entire world to the ground before I ever let them take her back. Once she finally drifted back to a peaceful sleep, I returned to my kitchen. I carefully stepped over the shattered coffee mug, opened my laptop, and called Dion. I told him we were no longer just building a legal defense. We were building an execution block. For the next 9 grueling hours, while the rest of the city of Atlanta slept, Dion and I waged an all-out digital war. We meticulously hunted down every single electronic breadcrumb Preston had carelessly left behind in his desperate, arrogant rush to secure the stolen funds. Dion systematically bypassed the encrypted firewalls Preston thought were secure and ripped the raw data straight from the bank's loan origination servers. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Dion had successfully retrieved the exact internet protocol logs from the precise moment the loan documents were digitally signed. The digital fingerprint was bulletproof. The loan had been authorized and signed from the exact IP address assigned to Preston's personal MacBook Pro. The signal pinged directly off the wireless router located in his supposedly under-renovation suburban home. He had not even bothered to use a virtual private network to mask his location. We did not stop there. If the federal government was preparing to look at my business, I needed to hand them the actual undeniable criminals on a silver platter. I directed Dion to dig aggressively into Chloe's financial history. My sister had always bragged to her friends about managing the household finances and orchestrating their flawless lifestyle, but I knew she was the primary architect behind the fraudulent paperwork. Dion accessed the hidden metadata attached to the loan application and discovered the tax returns Chloe had submitted to verify my firm's income. They were complete and utter fabrications. Chloe had blatantly altered my corporate tax documents, massively inflating the revenue numbers to qualify for the loan, and she had forged the digital signature of my previous accountant. Dion packaged the IP logs, the forged tax returns, and the routing numbers for the offshore Cayman accounts into a single heavily encrypted digital dossier. We now possessed the smoking gun, the bullets, and the exact fingerprints of the people holding the weapon. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the city skyline in shades of bruised purple and gold, I was already dialing the direct line for the Child Protective Services caseworker assigned to Maya's file. Her name was Ms. Higgins. She sounded exhausted and slightly annoyed when she answered the phone, clearly accustomed to bitter family members playing petty, vindictive games during custody disputes. I did not give her a single second to dismiss me. I spoke with absolute chilling authority. I informed her that the parents she was currently investigating for educational fraud and general neglect were now the primary subjects of an active federal money laundering investigation. I told her I was immediately forwarding a secure file containing absolute proof of massive financial crimes, forged federal tax documents, and violent household instability. I explicitly detailed Maya's nightmare, the smashed walls, the violent rages, and Chloe's drunken, apathetic negligence. I told Ms. Higgins that if she allowed my sister to regain custody of that child, she would be placing a minor directly into the hands of desperate, violent felons who were facing decades in federal prison. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Ms. Higgins dropped her tired, bureaucratic tone entirely. She gave me her direct, secure email address and promised that Maya's temporary placement with me would be upgraded to immediate high-priority protection. I closed my laptop. The adrenaline from the sleepless night kept my mind razor-sharp. I had successfully insulated my niece and weaponized the very fraud Preston intended to use to destroy me. I walked into the kitchen to finally clean up the spilled coffee and broken glass. Just as I tossed the paper towels into the trash can, my cell phone chimed loudly with a new voicemail notification. The caller ID displayed my mother's name, Beatrice. I pressed play, putting the phone on speaker, so her voice echoed through my quiet condo. Her tone was dripping with smug, aristocratic arrogance. She completely ignored the devastating truth I had exposed at the restaurant. She knew Preston's parents were actors, but she was deeply committed to the delusion to protect her country club status. She coldly ordered me not to bother showing up to Preston's parents' 40th anniversary gala at the club this coming Saturday. She stated that the family was proceeding with the lavish event to maintain appearances, and that my bitter, jealous presence was strictly forbidden. But she did not stop there. Beatrice let out a sharp, condescending laugh and delivered her final, venomous threat. She told me they were having the family judge officially revoke my temporary custody of Maya on Monday morning, and because of my refusal to blindly sign the loan documents, I would be sitting behind bars by Tuesday. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a flat, dead sound that perfectly matched the coldness spreading through my chest. Beatrice had delivered her threat with the casual, breezy tone of a woman confirming a lunch reservation. By Tuesday, she promised I would be sitting in a federal holding cell, and Maya would be handed right back to the monsters who had terrorized her. My own mother was actively orchestrating my imprisonment to protect a sociopath's fragile ego. I set my phone face down on the kitchen island, the metallic clink echoing in the quiet condo. I did not panic. Panic was a useless emotion reserved for people who did not have a plan. Instead, my mind latched onto a glaring, massive logical discrepancy in my mother's smug voicemail. Beatrice had explicitly told me not to bother showing up to Preston's parents' 40th anniversary gala at the country club this Saturday. I stood perfectly still, the gears in my head turning at lightning speed. Less than 24 hours ago, I had sat in the Capitol Grill and exposed Preston's background. I had presented absolute proof that the wealthy, aristocratic parents he had paraded around the country club last Christmas were hired actors. The real parents were broke retirees living on a fixed pension in a small rundown house in Ohio. So whose anniversary gala was Vernon and Beatrice hosting this weekend? Why would my status-obsessed parents throw a lavish country club event for the very people whose existence proved their son-in-law was a monumental fraud? I snatched my phone back up and immediately dialed Dion. He answered on the first ring, his keyboard already clacking aggressively in the background. I relayed Beatrice's voicemail and the glaring paradox of the anniversary gala. Dion went silent for a few seconds, the sound of his rapid typing filling the void. He told me to give him 10 minutes to run a deep sweep on the country club's private event registry and Preston's recent wire transfers. When Dion called back, his voice was laced with a mixture of professional awe and profound disgust. He had unraveled the final sickening layer of Preston's double life. Preston was not hosting the actors. He had flown his actual biological parents down from Ohio for the weekend. Dion had tracked a massive, non-refundable payment of $100,000, routed directly from my fraudulently acquired business loan to the country club's event department. Preston was using the money he stole from me to throw an impossibly lavish party for his real working-class family. He was bringing them to Atlanta to play the role of the self-made, wildly successful corporate titan. But the deception was infinitely darker than a simple vanity project. Dion had hacked into the digital RSVP list and the event website Preston had built for the occasion. Preston had created an entirely fabricated reality for his Ohio relatives. He had told his parents, his cousins, and his entire extended family that his wife Chloe was the brilliant founder and sole owner of my highly successful urban planning firm. He had stolen my entire professional identity and gifted it to my sister to elevate their status. Worse, he had preemptively assassinated my character to cover his tracks. According to the biography on the family website, I was the tragic, unstable, deeply broke sister who suffered from severe mental health issues. Preston had proudly written about how he and Chloe were generously supporting me financially, keeping me afloat out of the goodness of their hearts. He was using my money to fund a party celebrating my sister for building my company, while convincing his entire bloodline that I was a pathetic charity case. The sheer narcissistic audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Preston was essentially dancing on my professional grave while wearing my clothes. I thanked Dion and hung up the phone. A profound, icy calm settled over me. Preston had chosen the absolute worst possible venue to stage his masterpiece of deception. He had chosen a high-end commercial property. My entire career was built on commercial real estate, urban planning, and high-level event logistics. I knew the general manager of that specific country club. I knew the zoning laws, the floor plans, and the digital infrastructure of every major venue in the metropolitan Atlanta area. Preston thought he held all the cards because he was writing the checks, but he had fundamentally forgotten who he was dealing with. I did not need an invitation to the gala. I was going to own the room. I opened my laptop and pulled up the corporate registry for the state of Georgia. Years ago, I had established a blind limited liability company, a perfectly legal shell corporation I occasionally used to discreetly bid on commercial development plots without alerting competing firms. I immediately activated the LLC and contacted a trusted colleague who ran the premier audio-visual and event security contracting firm in the city. I knew that the country club routinely outsourced their high-end technical requirements for large-scale events. Within 2 hours using my blind LLC as the parent contractor, I had legally assumed the full event management and audio-visual contract for Preston's Gala. By Friday afternoon, I had acquired complete, unrestricted administrative access to the country club's grand ballroom. I possessed the master digital floor plans, the security camera clearance codes, and the direct administrative login to the venue's massive overhead projection and surround sound systems. Preston had spared no expense. He had ordered a state-of-the-art floor-to-ceiling digital media wall, to display a loving slideshow of his family history. It was a beautiful, highly expensive piece of technology, and I now had complete remote control over every single pixel and audio frequency it produced. I spent Friday night meticulously programming the system, setting a digital trap so flawless and devastating that no amount of smooth talking or parental denial could ever undo the damage. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that clung to the Atlanta pavement. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, parked entirely out of sight, in the secluded vendor loading dock directly behind the country club's grand ballroom. The tinted windows of my sedan shielded me from view, but my laptop screen brightly illuminated the interior of the car. Through the venue's secure high-definition security feeds, I had a perfect, unimpeded view of the gala unfolding inside. The room was dripping in excessive stolen wealth. Massive floral arrangements cascaded from the ceiling. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated with trays of expensive champagne. I watched my father Vernon actively working the room, grinning widely, and shaking hands with Preston's bewildered but incredibly proud Ohio relatives. I watched Chloe playing the role of the benevolent wealthy CEO, accepting glowing compliments from Preston's mother about her brilliant urban planning firm. I watched Preston holding court, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, looking like a man who had successfully conquered the world. They were so incredibly arrogant, so drunk on their own toxic delusions, that they had absolutely no idea the floor beneath them was about to drop out. I kept my finger hovering over the execute command on my laptop, waiting for the precise moment Preston would step up to the podium to deliver his highly anticipated toast. Suddenly, the bright screen of my cell phone lit up on the passenger seat, vibrating aggressively against the leather upholstery. I glanced down, expecting a final confirmation text from the audio-visual technician inside the booth. Instead, it was an urgent priority encrypted message from Dion. I opened the text, the blue light reflecting off my face in the dark car. The message was short, brutal, and terrifying. Preston is attempting to wire the remaining $100,000 out of your accounts right now. He just booked 2 one-way untraceable private charter flights to a non-extradition territory. He is planning to flee the country the absolute second this party is over. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Preston was not just celebrating. He was executing his exit strategy. The feds were closing in, he knew the net was tightening, and he was taking Chloe and the last of my stolen capital to vanish into thin air, leaving me to face the federal indictment alone. The digital clock on my dashboard flipped to 8 o'clock. The gala's itinerary showed the main toast was scheduled for 8:15. The clock was literally ticking, and the stakes had just escalated from a family confrontation to a desperate race against a federal prison sentence. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs, and prepared to detonate the room. I stared at the glowing text message from Dion, the harsh blue light illuminating the dark interior of my car. Preston was initiating the final desperate phase of his wire transfer. He was attempting to drain the last $100,000 of my stolen credit to fund 2 untraceable charter flights to a non-extradition zone. The sheer cowardice of his exit strategy was almost as offensive as the fraud itself. He intended to smile for the cameras, cut the anniversary cake with his parents, and then vanish into the night, leaving Chloe to face the impending federal indictment while I took the fall for the financial ruin. I typed a rapid single-sentence reply to Dion, instructing him to deploy the digital stall tactic we had engineered to lock the outgoing funds in a pending verification loop. I was not going to let Preston leave the building. I turned off my phone and reached into the passenger seat. I slipped a bulky black catering jacket over my shoulders, concealing the garment underneath. I clipped the laminated all-access vendor badge to the lapel. Stepping out of my sedan, the oppressive Atlanta heat hit me instantly, but my focus remained absolute. I walked purposefully toward the service entrance at the rear of the country club. The loading dock was a frenzy of activity, a blur of waitstaff carrying silver trays and florists rushing to replace wilted centerpieces. Because I legally held the primary event management contract through my blind LLC, my badge possessed the highest security clearance available. I bypassed the main security checkpoint with a simple swipe of my credential, the red scanner turning a welcoming green. I navigated the labyrinth of concrete service corridors, bypassing the bustling kitchens and the chaotic staging areas until I reached the heavy, soundproof double doors leading directly into the grand ballroom. I paused in the dim lighting of the hallway. I unzipped the oversized catering jacket, letting it drop to the concrete floor. Underneath, I wore a custom-tailored floor-length emerald gown. It was constructed of heavy silk that draped flawlessly, a masterpiece of precise structural design. It was not a dress meant for blending in. It was armor forged from my own earned success, a stark visual contrast to the stolen rented luxury my family was currently parading around in. I checked my reflection in the polished brass of the door handle, took a slow, deep breath, and pushed the doors open. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of obscene, fraudulent opulence. Preston had effectively set fire to my stolen corporate funds to create a monument to his own ego. Towering ice sculptures carved into swans dominated the buffet stations. A 12-piece string quartet played softly from a raised balcony. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos drifted through the crowd, distributing glasses of vintage champagne and caviar canapes. At the far end of the room stood the massive floor-to-ceiling digital media wall I had personally programmed the night before, currently displaying a looping high-definition montage of Preston and Chloe smiling on various yachts and private jets. I stepped into the shadows near a towering floral arrangement and observed the grotesque theater unfolding before me. Preston and Chloe were holding court in the center of the room, soaking up the blind adoration of their guests. Preston's real parents, a sweet-looking, deeply modest older couple from Ohio, stood nearby. They looked completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding them. His mother was clutching a small, inexpensive handbag, gazing up at her son with tears of absolute awe in her eyes. They genuinely believed their boy was a self-made titan of industry. They had no idea the champagne they were drinking was financed by multiple federal felonies. Standing directly next to them, playing the roles of aristocratic royalty, were Vernon and Beatrice. My mother was dripping in diamonds, laughing loudly and gesturing with her champagne flute, while Vernon nodded along with the smug satisfaction of a patriarch who believed his bloodline was flawless. They were actively socializing with the very people who proved their son-in-law was a broke con artist, yet their pathological need to protect their country club status rendered them completely blind to the reality. They were mingling with middle-class retirees while pretending they were old-money shipping magnates. The absolute delusion required to maintain that facade was staggering. Chloe was putting on the performance of a lifetime. I watched her rest a manicured hand on her mother-in-law's shoulder, adopting the posture of a benevolent, wildly successful CEO. She was actively accepting congratulations for building my urban planning firm. I could read her lips from across the room as she humbly thanked a guest for praising her real estate empire. She had stolen my career, my money, and my identity, and she was wearing them all like a cheap rented costume. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic clinking echoed through the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing. The low murmur of wealthy conversation faded into an expectant silence. Preston was standing on the main stage, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. He adjusted the lapels of his custom tuxedo, flashing a brilliant, charismatic smile at the crowd. The spotlights shifted, illuminating him perfectly against the glowing backdrop of the digital media wall. He was exactly where he wanted to be, the absolute center of attention, moments away from making his grand escape. Preston grasped the microphone and began his speech. His voice boomed through the sophisticated surround sound system. He welcomed his parents, laying on a thick layer of fabricated humility, thanking them for instilling him with the core values that had led to his massive corporate success. He painted a picture of a man who had conquered the business world through sheer grit and determination. The audience listened with rapt attention, completely captivated by the charming sociopath on stage. Then Preston shifted his gaze toward Chloe. He lowered his voice to a tone of deep, manufactured reverence. He told the crowd that behind every great man was a woman of equal or greater brilliance. He raised his glass toward my sister. He announced that he wanted to dedicate this next toast to his beautiful wife, Chloe. He declared with absolutely flawless conviction that she was the true powerhouse of the family. He praised her for building her incredible real estate empire from the ground up, stating that her vision and business acumen were the primary engines funding their magnificent life. Preston then let out a soft, staged sigh, adopting a look of profound, empathetic sorrow. He told the crowd that their success was especially meaningful because it allowed them to financially support those less fortunate. He explicitly mentioned Chloe's struggling, unstable sister, spinning a tragic narrative about how they were selflessly keeping me afloat during a dark mental health crisis. He praised Chloe's endless charity and patience for carrying my dead weight so I would not end up on the streets. The crowd murmured in sympathetic approval. My mother Beatrice dabbed at a fake tear in the corner of her eye, playing the part of the heartbroken but proud matriarch to absolute perfection. It was time. I stepped out from the shadows of the floral arrangement and into the bright ambient light of the ballroom. I did not rush. I walked down the center aisle with the slow, measured pace of an executioner. The heavy silk of my emerald gown caught the light, radiating a cold, undeniable authority. As I moved forward, the guests closest to the aisle naturally parted their eyes, drawn to the sudden commanding shift in the room's energy. My mother saw me first. The fake sympathetic smile completely vanished from Beatrice's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the polished marble floor, but the sound was entirely lost in the growing quiet of the room. Chloe turned her head, following her mother's horrified gaze. When she saw me advancing down the aisle, her jaw went slack. The benevolent CEO facade instantly disintegrated into panicked, animalistic fear. Vernon stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, but he was too frozen by shock to intercept me. Preston was still speaking, his gaze fixed on the back of the room. He was mid-sentence, continuing his tearful monologue about family charity, when he finally noticed the sudden, profound silence washing over the crowd. He lowered his glass and looked down. I reached the front of the room. I did not pause at the base of the stage. I walked smoothly up the short flight of carpeted stairs until I was standing directly next to the man who had actively tried to send me to federal prison. Preston froze. His eyes bulged and the color rapidly drained from his face until he looked like a panicked ghost. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. His charismatic aura evaporated, leaving only a cornered, sweating fraud staring at his own impending destruction. I stepped right into his personal space. I did not break eye contact. I reached out, maintaining complete and absolute calm, and pulled the microphone directly out of his trembling hand. The microphone felt heavy and metallic in my hand. A brief, sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the air, signaling the abrupt transfer of power. Preston's hand remained suspended in midair, frozen in the exact position it had been when I effortlessly stripped the device from his grip. He looked like a marionette whose strings had just been brutally severed by an invisible blade. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white under the harsh glare of the stage spotlights. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was not just quiet. It was a suffocating, breathless vacuum. Hundreds of wealthy guests, country club elites, and Preston's modest Ohio relatives stared at the stage in collective, paralyzed shock. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes had ceased entirely. The soft melodies of the string quartet faded into a tense, vibrating hum. I brought the microphone to my lips. I did not yell. I did not let a single ounce of the boiling rage inside my chest bleed into my tone. My voice rolled through the $1 million surround sound system crystal clear, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and the intricate crystal chandeliers above. "Good evening," I said, allowing the words to hang in the heavy air for a fraction of a second. My gaze swept across the sea of bewildered faces. I deliberately bypassed my seething parents and locked my eyes directly onto the sweet, confused faces of Preston's real parents sitting in the front row. I am Keisha. I stated my posture absolutely rigid. I am the actual founder, the sole owner, and the chief executive officer of the urban planning firm you all just applauded. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, sweeping through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind across a still lake. Chloe was the first to shatter the frozen tableau. The benevolent, poised facade she had been parading around the room for the past 2 hours violently disintegrated. She scrambled up the side steps of the stage, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished wood. Her eyes were wide, darting erratically between me and the audience. She let out a shrill, manic, entirely unhinged laugh that echoed harshly through the microphone feed. "Oh my goodness!" Chloe shrieked, waving her hands in a desperate, chaotic gesture toward the crowd. "Please, everyone, forgive my sister. She is not well. She has been struggling with some very severe, very tragic mental health issues lately. We have been trying so hard to get her the psychiatric help she needs. She is having a terrible episode. Please just ignore her. She does not know what she is saying." It was a pathetic, desperate performance. She was clinging to the very lie Preston had meticulously seeded on the family website, praying the high society crowd would politely look away from the ugly reality of a family breakdown. But the guests were not looking away. They were captivated by the train wreck unfolding on stage. I simply stood there, an immovable pillar in my emerald silk gown, projecting nothing but absolute earned authority. I looked at Chloe with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. Preston realized instantly that Chloe's hysterical laughter was not saving the narrative. The confused whispers in the crowd were growing louder. He looked out at his real parents, whose faces were contorted in confusion, and then his eyes darted toward the side exit of the ballroom. He was calculating his escape, realizing his window to reach the non-extradition charter flights was rapidly closing. But he needed to silence me first. The sheer panic in his chest overrode whatever lingering sense of self-preservation he possessed. His face twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate aggression. With a sudden violent burst of energy, Preston lunged directly at me. He threw his entire body weight forward, his hands reaching aggressively to snatch the microphone back from my grip. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to cower the way Maya did when he flew into his violent rages behind closed doors. He was fundamentally wrong. I did not retreat a single inch. I planted my left foot, shifting my weight with fluid, calculated precision, and smoothly sidestepped his clumsy attack. Preston's momentum carried him forward into empty space. His expensive bespoke tuxedo jacket pulled awkwardly across his shoulders as he stumbled heavily, his slick dress shoes losing traction on the polished stage floor. He crashed hard against the wooden acrylic podium, knocking a massive floral arrangement to the ground with a loud, echoing thud. Dirt water and crushed white roses scattered across the stage. A chorus of shocked murmurs and stifled screams erupted from the front rows. The charming, wealthy titan of industry was currently scrambling on his hands and knees in a puddle of dirty water, looking exactly like the cornered, pathetic fraud he truly was. Vernon could no longer tolerate the public humiliation of his chosen son-in-law. My father marched toward the center aisle, his face a vibrant, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against his stiff white collar. He completely abandoned any pretense of country club decorum, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "Security!" Vernon roared, his voice carrying over the rising murmurs of the confused guests. "Where the hell is the security staff? Get this unstable woman off the stage immediately. I demand that you remove her from this property before I have her arrested for trespassing. She is trespassing on a private event." I looked down at my father. He was actively screaming for armed guards to physically drag his own daughter out of a building to protect a man who was actively draining his bank accounts and framing his family for federal crimes. The absolute irony of his demand almost made me smile. Vernon was commanding a security detail that he believed was employed by the country club. He had absolutely no idea that every single guard standing at the perimeter of the ballroom, every audio technician, and every event manager was currently on the payroll of my blind LLC. I owned the room. I literally controlled the very ground he was standing on. I lifted the microphone back to my mouth, my voice slicing effortlessly through Vernon's frantic yelling and the chaotic rising volume of the crowd. "No one is leaving," I stated, my tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "And no one is removing me. The only person planning an immediate departure tonight is Preston, who currently has 2 one-way private charter flights booked to a non-extradition zone." I did not flinch as Preston scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that I knew about his escape plan. I did not acknowledge Chloe's renewed hysterical sobbing as she tried to pull her husband up from the floor. I looked straight over the heads of the crowd, past the crystal chandeliers, and directed my gaze to the tinted glass window of the elevated audio-visual booth at the back of the ballroom. I raised my left hand into the air. With a single sharp echoing motion, I snapped my fingers. Instantly, Dion executed the kill command. The soft romantic uplighting in the ballroom went completely black. The string quartet gasped as the stage plunged into darkness, plunging the entire crowd into a momentary breathless void. Then the massive floor-to-ceiling digital media screens behind me dropped down and flashed brilliantly to life, illuminating the entire breathless ballroom with the blinding high-definition evidence of their complete and utter destruction. The sheer panic in Preston's eyes as he bolted off the stage was the look of a man who suddenly realized he was out of track to run on. He hit the heavy oak swinging doors of the service exit with his shoulder bursting through them with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a trapped animal. The doors swung wildly in his wake, giving the stunned ballroom a brief, chaotic glimpse of the stainless steel kitchen corridor before sealing shut. He was abandoning his wife, his parents, and the shattered remains of his fabricated life, sprinting toward the loading dock in a desperate bid to vanish into the humid Atlanta night. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere had mutated from shock into total, unmitigated pandemonium. The audio recording from the Capitol Grill was still echoing through the surround sound system. Vernon's menacing threats regarding his corrupt police connections vibrating against the crystal chandeliers. Vernon looked around the room, his eyes wide and frantic. He was completely surrounded by the very country club elites, whose approval he worshipped above his own children. He could see the absolute disgust and judgment etched on their faces. The men he played golf with, the investors, he courted the socialites. Beatrice desperately tried to impress. They were all actively backing away from him, as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. He opened his mouth, raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture, attempting to string together an excuse, but the sheer volume of his own recorded blackmail drowned out his pathetic attempts at damage control. Beatrice had completely collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands and weeping hysterically, mourning the instant, irrevocable death of her social standing. Arthur Preston's father did not chase after his son. He stood in the center aisle, his shoulders slumped, looking suddenly older and deeply broken. He slowly turned to his wife, who was quietly sobbing into a tissue, and gently took her arm. They did not say a word to Vernon or Beatrice. They simply turned their backs on the horrific display of stolen wealth and began quietly walking toward the main entrance, their dignity completely intact, despite the devastating betrayal they had just endured. On stage, Chloe was still on her knees, the crushed white roses staining the fabric of her expensive designer dress. Her victim narrative had been entirely obliterated by the audio recording of her own venomous greed. She looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. The arrogant, entitled sister I had known my entire life was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, ruined woman who finally understood that her actions had absolute, inescapable consequences. She reached a trembling hand toward me, her voice dropping to a desperate, hoarse whisper. She begged me to turn off the audio. She pleaded with me to help her, claiming she had no money, no husband, and no way to survive the impending federal investigation. She asked me what she was supposed to do now. I looked down at her, maintaining the same cold, clinical detachment I had held since I stepped out of my car. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I leaned down, ensuring the microphone was far away from my mouth, and spoke quietly so only she could hear me. I told her she was going to stand up, walk out of the building, and immediately retain the best federal defense attorney she could possibly find. I informed her that Dion had already transmitted the entire encrypted dossier, the IP logs, the forged tax returns, the offshore routing numbers, and the audio recording directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI, the IRS, and the local district attorney's office. I told her the federal government was already dismantling the digital walls Preston had built, and she was going to have to explain exactly how her signature ended up on highly illegal loan origination documents. I straightened my posture, looking out over the chaotic ballroom one last time. I had accomplished exactly what I came to do. I had surgically excised the cancer from my life, protected my business, and permanently neutralized the threats against my freedom. I turned my back on my weeping sister and my ruined parents and walked calmly toward the side exit of the stage. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into the dimly lit quiet service corridor, the muffled sounds of the ruined gala fading behind me. Dion was already waiting for me near the loading dock, leaning against the cinder block wall with his arms crossed and a deeply satisfied smirk on his face. He held up his tablet, tapping the screen with one finger. He informed me that he had successfully maintained the digital hold on the $100,000 wire transfer until the exact moment Preston had burst through the kitchen doors. Then he had executed a complete hard reversal. He showed me the bank confirmation screen. The stolen capital had bypassed the Cayman accounts entirely and had been aggressively routed directly back to the original loan servicer, immediately satisfying a massive portion of the fraudulent debt. He had effectively severed Preston's financial lifeline in the exact moment the man was trying to flee the country. Dion chuckled a low, cynical sound and mentioned that Preston's non-extradition charter flights were scheduled to depart in less than an hour. But considering his credit cards were now tied to frozen accounts, and his offshore safety net no longer existed, he doubted the pilot was going to let him board the aircraft. I nodded, the heavy, oppressive tension finally beginning to drain from my shoulders. I thanked Dion for his flawless execution and told him to send the final invoices for the event management to Vernon's personal accounting firm. If my father wanted to host a luxury gala, he was going to pay the premium contractor rates. I walked out into the humid Atlanta night, the heavy air feeling surprisingly refreshing against my skin. I handed my valet ticket to the attendant, who quickly retrieved my sedan. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool and familiar. I did not look back at the country club. I pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the highway, the bright city lights blurring into long rhythmic streaks as I accelerated. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a text message from the private security firm I had hired earlier that afternoon to monitor my condo. They confirmed that the perimeter was secure, the new deadbolts were engaged, and Maya was sleeping peacefully in the guest room, completely unaware of the war that had just been fought to guarantee her safety. I drove through the quiet streets, mentally preparing for the intense legal battles and the bureaucratic fallout that would inevitably consume the coming weeks. I knew the FBI investigation would be grueling, and untangling the remainder of the fraudulent loan would require massive legal resources. But as I pulled into my secure parking garage, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. I had faced the absolute worst of my family's betrayal, stared down the barrel of a federal indictment, and engineered my own salvation. I had protected my niece, defended my life's work, and proven that my success was not just a title on a business card, it was a weapon I knew exactly how to wield. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the elevator, ready to build a new life entirely on my own terms. The massive floor-to-ceiling digital media screens behind me dropped down and flashed brilliantly to life, illuminating the entire breathless ballroom with the blinding high-definition evidence of their complete and utter destruction. I turned slightly, raising a small, sleek remote I had kept concealed in the palm of my hand. I did not yell, nor did I allow any emotion to bleed into my voice. I narrated the slides with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate board presentation. "You are looking at a forged birth certificate," I announced, my voice echoing through the sophisticated surround sound system. Beside the fabricated document, the screen split to display a series of stark, heavily redacted Child Protective Services neglect files. The grim reality of the documents clashed violently with the obscene opulence of the room. These files document the severe starvation, isolation, and medical neglect of a little girl named Maya, my niece. The child Chloe and Preston actively hid away in a dark, empty house while they paraded around this city, spending stolen money to fund the illusion you see before you tonight. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the audience. The wealthy guests, the investors, and the country club elite stared at the towering screens, pure disgust, replacing their previous confusion. I clicked the remote. The image shifted sharply. "Slide 2, I stated. The screen now displayed a massive stack of highly illegal loan origination documents. "This is a $300,000 fraudulent loan taken out illegally against the assets of my urban planning firm. And right here, highlighted in red, is the undeniable forensic IP address trace. It proves without a shadow of a doubt that these documents were digitally signed, authorized, and submitted directly from Preston's personal device." Another click of the remote. The static images vanished, replaced by a live, pulsing financial dashboard. A green loading bar hovered ominously at 99%. And finally, I continued, letting the sheer weight of the reality crush the air out of the room. What you are witnessing right now is a live, in-progress wire transfer. Preston is currently attempting to drain the last remaining drops of my stolen corporate funds into an untraceable offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands. This entire anniversary gala was never a celebration of their love or their success. It was a calculated smokescreen designed to distract all of you while they executed their final exit strategy. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping violently against the polished marble floor. Arthur Preston's real father stood up from his seat in the front row. He was a retired, no-nonsense military veteran, a man who had built his life on a foundation of strict honor and unwavering discipline. His face, which only minutes ago had been shining with proud tears, was now carved from stone. He did not look at me. He stared directly at the digital screens, absorbing the undeniable objective proof of his son's sociopathic behavior. Slowly, Arthur turned his piercing gaze toward the stage. The charismatic, magnetic aura Preston had weaponized for his entire life completely evaporated under the weight of his father's stare. "Is this true?" Arthur demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried absolute authority. "Look me in the eye, boy, and tell me if this is true." Preston opened his mouth, his jaw working silently, but no words came out. He was suffocating on the toxic fumes of his own collapsed empire. Chloe, sensing the imminent catastrophic end of her aristocratic lifestyle, immediately defaulted to her primary survival tactic. She abandoned her husband in a heartbeat. She threw herself to her knees, bursting into hysterical, theatrical tears. "He made me do it!" Chloe wailed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at Preston. She looked out at the horrified crowd, desperately trying to play the victim. "I didn't know what was happening. Preston controlled all the bank accounts. He forced me to sign those loan papers. I was terrified of him. I had no choice." It was a masterful, desperate pivot, an attempt to paint herself as the naive, abused wife of a financial predator. I did not let her finish the performance. I raised my left hand and signaled the audio-visual booth where Dion was stationed. "Let's hear exactly how terrified you really were, Chloe," I said. The digital screens went completely black, replaced instantly by a single pulsing green audio waveform. The crisp, high-definition recording we had captured at the Capitol Grill flooded the ballroom's PA system. Chloe's own voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, cruel, arrogant, and dripping with malicious greed. The entire room listened in paralyzed silence as she laughed about claiming my assets, mocking my supposed mental breakdown, and gloating about her stolen wealth. Then the audio shifted. Vernon's voice joined the playback. His aggressive, booming threats regarding his corrupt police connections and his calculated intent to have his own daughter permanently committed to a psychiatric ward reverberated through the gala. The audio recording was the final lethal blow to the facade. Preston looked at the faces of his country club peers, the investors he had courted, and his own devastated parents. He realized there was no charm, no lie, and no manipulation left in the world that could save him from the federal evidence displayed in that room. The sheer panic in his chest overrode everything else. He turned and bolted. He abandoned his weeping wife, his humiliated family, and sprinted blindly toward the heavy oak swinging doors of the back service exit. He hit the doors with his shoulder bursting through them with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a trapped animal. But the trap had already snapped shut. The moment the heavy oak doors swung open, Preston slammed directly into a solid wall of dark windbreakers. 5 federal agents from the FBI's Cybercrimes Division were standing in the service corridor, waiting patiently for him. Dion had forwarded the complete encrypted dossier of wire fraud evidence to the Bureau earlier that afternoon, and they had moved with absolute precision. The agents did not hesitate. They grabbed Preston by his custom-tailored lapels, spun him around violently, and slammed him against the concrete wall of the loading dock. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed through the open service doors, ringing out loud and clear for the entire ballroom to hear. Simultaneously, 2 more federal agents marched briskly down the center aisle of the ballroom, their gold badges clearly visible against their jackets. They stepped onto the stage and approached Chloe. She tried to scramble backward, her fake tears turning into genuine screams of pure panic as the agents firmly grasped her arms. They secured her wrists in handcuffs right there on the stage, the cold metal glinting against the fabric of her expensive designer formal wear. The wealthy guests gasped, stepping back in unison to create a wide, terrified perimeter around the disgraced couple. Beatrice and Vernon watched the federal agents drag their chosen golden child off the stage in irons. The aristocratic social status they worshipped above their own flesh and blood had just been publicly spectacularly executed. Raw survival instinct took over. In a breathtaking display of self-preservation, they abandoned Chloe without a single second of hesitation. Vernon rushed toward me, his face pale and dripping with sweat, his hands raised in a desperate, placating gesture. Beatrice trailed right behind him, her diamond necklaces catching the stage lights as she practically tripped over the hem of her own gown in her haste to reach me. "Keisha, please!" Vernon begged, his voice trembling with a pathetic, cowardly desperation I had never heard from him before. He was no longer the arrogant patriarch threatening to have me locked away. He was a terrified old man watching his entire life burn to the ground. "We can fix this. We will pay you back every single cent they took. Just talk to the agents. Tell the feds this is all a massive family misunderstanding. We will put our house up for their bail right now. We will handle this internally. You cannot let them do this to our family's name." I looked at the man who had actively conspired to destroy my life to protect a fraud. I looked at the woman who had enabled his delusion for decades. I did not feel a single shred of empathy. I smiled, a slow, cold expression that froze the blood in Vernon's veins. "You can't post bail, Dad," I said, my voice echoing with crystal clarity through the lingering silence of the room. "Because you and Mom co-signed Preston's fraudulent shell company to hide the money. The FBI froze all your assets and seized your bank accounts 20 minutes ago." Vernon stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant, as the reality of his total financial ruin annihilated him. His knees buckled beneath his weight. He collapsed heavily into a velvet-lined chair, clutching his chest, as the pulsing, rhythmic glow of blue and red police cruisers began to flash relentlessly through the towering ballroom windows. The silence in my downtown executive office was absolute, a profound and pristine contrast to the chaotic symphony of police sirens and shattered glass that had consumed the grand ballroom 14 days ago. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the bustling Atlanta traffic far below. The morning sun cast a sharp geometric shadow across my mahogany desk. My firm had weathered the storm. The immediate danger was eradicated. Preston and Chloe were currently sitting in separate federal holding facilities, both having been denied bail as high flight risks. The digital walls they had built were entirely dismantled by the FBI Cybercrimes Division, and the fraudulent loan that had threatened to destroy my company was actively being untangled by a small army of forensic accountants. My intercom buzzed a single sharp tone that sliced through the quiet room. My executive assistant's voice echoed through the speaker, maintaining her usual crisp professionalism, informing me that my 9 o'clock appointment had arrived. I did not turn around immediately. I told her to send them in. The heavy glass doors of my office clicked open. I waited a full 10 seconds before I turned my back on the skyline and faced the room. Vernon and Beatrice stood awkwardly just inside the threshold, looking entirely out of place in the sleek, modern architecture of my corporate sanctuary. The transformation in their physical appearance was staggering. The arrogant country club patriarch and the diamond-draped matriarch were completely gone. In their place stood two exhausted, terrified, and rapidly aging people. Beatrice was wearing a drab, wrinkled trench coat over a plain beige dress. Her hair, usually sprayed and styled into a flawless helmet of social superiority, hung flat and lifeless around her hollow face. She clutched a cheap faux leather handbag to her chest, like a physical shield. Vernon looked even worse. He wore an ill-fitting gray suit that seemed to swallow his shrinking frame. His face was deeply lined, his skin a sallow, sickly gray, and his hands trembled visibly at his sides. The suffocating weight of their impending destruction had crushed the absolute life out of them. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them a greeting. I walked slowly to my high-backed leather chair and sat down, resting my hands flat on the polished desktop. Vernon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He took a hesitant step forward, crossing the vast expanse of the office floor with the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man walking to his own execution. Beatrice trailed close behind him, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. When they finally reached the edge of my desk, Vernon attempted to clear his throat. He opened his mouth, but his usual booming, authoritative voice was completely absent. Instead, a dry, raspy croak emerged. He told me that they had nowhere else to go. He explained, his voice breaking with genuine, unadulterated fear, that the federal government was moving forward with the indictments. Because they had willingly co-signed Preston's fraudulent shell company to hide the stolen funds, the FBI considered them active accomplices in a massive wire fraud conspiracy. Their bank accounts remained entirely frozen. The country club board had voted unanimously to expel them the morning after the gala. Their wealthy friends had completely abandoned them, refusing to answer their phone calls or respond to their desperate emails. Beatrice began to weep, a quiet, pathetic sobbing that she tried to stifle behind her hand. Vernon stared at me, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. He confessed that they had received the official foreclosure notice on their house yesterday morning. They were entirely destitute. They had no money for groceries, no money for the mortgage, and most importantly, no money for a legal defense. They were staring down the barrel of a federal indictment with a public defender, and they were terrified they were going to die in a federal prison. Vernon placed his trembling hands on the edge of my desk. He begged me for a loan. He swore on his life that they would pay me back every single penny. He pleaded with me to find some trace of family loyalty in my heart, begging me to front the cash for a high-powered defense attorney to keep them out of jail. I sat in total silence, letting his desperate pleas echo and fade into the quiet atmosphere of the room. I observed them with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a terminal diagnosis. They had spent my entire life viewing me as a stepping stone, a financial resource to be exploited, and a disappointment to be hidden away. Now, stripped of their fraudulent wealth and their aristocratic delusions, they were completely at my mercy. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I reached inside and pulled out a single crisp cashier's check. I placed it squarely in the center of the dark mahogany wood. Vernon's eyes locked onto the piece of paper. Beatrice stopped crying, leaning forward with a sudden, desperate spark of hope. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any warmth or familial affection. I explained that the cashier's check was made out for a very specific, carefully calculated amount. It was precisely enough money to retain a highly competent federal defense attorney. It was enough to negotiate a plea deal. It was enough to keep them out of a federal penitentiary. However, I made it absolutely clear what the check was not. It was not enough to save their house from foreclosure. It was not enough to maintain their luxury lifestyle. It was not a bailout for their country club dues, their car leases, or their social standing. It was a lifeline for their basic physical freedom and nothing more. I told them they were going to lose the house, they were going to lose the cars, and they were going to have to learn how to survive in the reality they had actively created. Vernon nodded frantically, reaching a shaking hand toward the check. He told me he understood. He told me he would take whatever I was willing to offer. Before his fingers could graze the paper, I smoothly slid a thick, heavy legal folder out from under my blotter and placed it directly over the check. I looked Vernon dead in the eye. I told him the money was not a loan, it was a transaction. And the transaction came with 3 ironclad non-negotiable terms. I opened the folder to reveal the stark black and white print of the documents inside. I pointed to the first document. I informed them that it was a sworn, legally binding affidavit. By signing it, they would officially state under penalty of perjury that they had full knowledge of Chloe and Preston's fraudulent activities. They would explicitly detail how Preston manipulated the shell company and how Chloe actively participated in the theft of my corporate assets. I told them they were going to hand the federal prosecutors the exact ammunition needed to ensure their golden child and her sociopathic husband spent the next 2 decades behind bars. Beatrice let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She shook her head rapidly, protesting that she could not testify against her own daughter. She begged me not to make her destroy Chloe. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I reminded her that Chloe had not hesitated to destroy me, and if she preferred a federal prison cell to signing the paper, she was free to walk out of my office empty-handed. Beatrice swallowed her protests, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as the reality of her powerlessness washed over her. I turned to the second document. I stated that this was a total, irrevocable relinquishment of any and all grandparental rights to Maya. I explained that I had already initiated formal adoption proceedings. My niece was currently safe, thriving, and receiving the medical and psychological care she had been denied her entire life. I told them they would never see her again. They would never be allowed to use her as a prop, and they would never be allowed to subject her to the toxic, narcissistic environment they had cultivated. They were to sign away every legal claim to the child they had actively watched starve. Vernon stared at the paperwork, his jaw tight, but he offered no resistance. He knew he had no leverage left to fight me. I turned to the final document in the folder. I looked at Beatrice, whose entire identity was wrapped up in her social perception and her pristine standing in the community. I told them that the third condition required a public execution of their facade. This coming Sunday, they were going to stand in front of the entire congregation at their megachurch. They were going to walk up to the pulpit, look at their wealthy peers, and publicly confess. They were going to admit into a live microphone that they had actively enabled a thief, conspired to steal from their youngest daughter, and abandoned their defenseless granddaughter. They were going to strip away their own false righteousness in front of the only people whose opinions they still valued. Beatrice began to shake violently. She grabbed Vernon's arm, begging him to find another way. She sobbed that she could not face the church, that the humiliation would literally kill her. She pleaded with me to take the house, to take the cars, to take anything else but her dignity. I leaned back in my leather chair, resting my elbows on the armrests. I told her that she lost her dignity the moment she decided my life was expendable. The terms were absolute. They could sign the papers and walk out with the check, or they could leave the building and wait for the FBI to kick down their front door. The silence returned to the office, heavy and suffocating. Vernon looked at the cashier's check, peeking out from under the legal folder. He looked at his weeping wife. Then, with the slow, defeated movement of a completely broken man, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a silver pen. He leaned over my desk and signed his name on the dotted line of the affidavit. He flipped to the next page and signed away his rights to Maya. He flipped to the final page and signed the agreement for the public confession. He silently handed the pen to Beatrice. She took it with a trembling grip. She closed her eyes, tears splashing onto the pristine legal paper, and signed her name next to his. I smoothly pulled the folder back across the desk, closing it with a sharp, definitive snap. I slid the cashier's check forward. Vernon picked it up, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. He did not say thank you. There was nothing left to say. I reached over to my intercom and pressed the silver button. I instructed my security team to come up to the executive suite. 30 seconds later, 2 broad-shouldered security guards in dark suits entered the office. I did not look at my parents as they turned away from my desk. I simply instructed the guards to escort Vernon and Beatrice out of the building and ensure they did not return. I turned my chair back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling sunlit city. I listened to the heavy glass doors of my office click shut, sealing the room in perfect, uninterrupted silence. 6 months evaporated the ashes of their fabricated empire, leaving behind nothing but the stark, unforgiving reality of federal justice. The legal dust had finally settled over the ruins of Preston and Chloe's fraudulent lives. The justice system moves slowly, but when handed a perfectly gift-wrapped encrypted dossier of indisputable evidence, it moves with the crushing, inescapable force of a freight train. Preston was currently residing in a maximum security federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania, serving an 8-year sentence without the possibility of early parole. The charming, charismatic titan of industry, who had so effortlessly commanded stages and charmed country club elites, was now just another inmate in a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. The magnetic aura he had weaponized his entire life was utterly useless behind steel bars and razor wire. The federal prosecutors did not care about his tailored suits or his manufactured charm. They cared about the airtight forensic IP logs and the wire fraud documentation Dion had dropped directly into their laps. There were no vintage champagne toasts in the prison cafeteria, no digital media walls to broadcast his manufactured success, and no offshore accounts to finance his delusions. The federal government had dismantled his shell company brick by digital brick, ensuring that when he eventually walked out of those concrete walls, he would enter a world where his name was permanently synonymous with financial ruin and identity theft. His Ohio parents, shattered by the horrific reality of their son's sociopathy, had returned to their modest lives, refusing to answer his collect calls. Chloe had fallen the hardest. The golden child, the brilliant real estate mogul who had so proudly accepted accolades for my stolen achievements, was entirely stripped of her rented aristocratic glamour. Desperate to avoid spending the next decade in a neighboring federal cell block, she had surrendered, immediately accepting a brutal, uncompromising plea deal. Her sentence kept her out of a prison cell, but it chained her to a lifetime of humiliating financial servitude. She was currently working 40 hours a week at a harsh, fluorescent-lit discount retail store on the industrial outskirts of the city. She wore a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform, a far cry from the heavy silk gowns and diamond necklaces she had paraded around the country club. She spent her days scanning barcodes and folding cheap garments, forced to politely serve the very same working-class shoppers she had spent her entire life looking down upon. The humiliation was a daily grinding punishment. Every single paycheck she earned was immediately intercepted and garnished by the state to pay off the massive court-ordered restitution, leaving her with barely enough to afford the bus pass she needed to get back to her cramped, drafty studio apartment. The high society friends she had so desperately tried to impress had vanished the second the handcuffs clicked around her wrists on that stage. She had nothing left to steal, and therefore, she was nothing. Vernon and Beatrice were living out their own personal suffocating purgatory. True to my word, the cashier's check had kept them out of federal prison, but the cost of their physical freedom was their complete and total social annihilation. They had signed the affidavit. They had relinquished their rights. And on that fateful Sunday, they had stood before their massive, affluent congregation and delivered the public confession I demanded. The resulting fallout was swift, brutal, and absolute. The country club community they had worshipped exiled them instantly. They lost the sprawling suburban house to foreclosure. They lost the leased luxury cars to repo men in the middle of the night. They were currently renting a tiny, cramped ground-floor apartment in a deteriorating complex miles away from their former kingdom. The walls of their new reality were paper-thin, vibrating constantly with the sounds of highway traffic and noisy neighbors. There were no more catered dinners, no more bespoke suits, and no more fawning acquaintances. They spent their days sitting in a small living room with peeling linoleum floors, surrounded by the cheap plastic remnants of a life they could no longer afford. When they walked down the street or went to the local discount grocery store, People they once knew actively crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with them. They stewed in the toxic, crushing realization that they had sacrificed their only loyal daughter to protect a mirage, and now they had absolutely no one left to perform for. But their ruin was merely the background noise to my actual triumph. The true victory did not happen in a federal courtroom or a discount retail store. It happened on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in the sterile, echoing halls of the Atlanta family court. The heavy thud of the judge's wooden gavel hitting the sounding block was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a nightmare officially ending. I pushed open the heavy brass-handled oak doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the sunlit corridor. In my right hand, I held a thick, embossed manila envelope containing the official judge-signed adoption decree. It was the most valuable piece of paper I had ever possessed in my entire life. It carried more weight than any corporate contract, any bank statement, or any vendor agreement. Maya was legally, permanently, and irrevocably mine. I looked down at the little girl holding my left hand. The transformation over the past 6 months had been nothing short of miraculous. The frail, terrified, starving child that Chloe and Preston had hidden away in a dark, empty house was completely, entirely gone. Maya was glowing. Her cheeks were full and flushed with a healthy, vibrant pink. Her dark hair, which had been brittle and neglected, was now thick, shiny, and braided into 2 perfect bouncing pigtails. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress and spotless white sneakers. But the most profound change was in her eyes. The haunted, hollow stare of a neglected child had been replaced by a bright, curious, untethered sparkle. She walked with a bounce in her step, swinging our joined hands and chattering animatedly about the dogs we had seen at the park and the new books she was reading. She was safe. She knew she was safe, and she knew she would never go hungry or be locked in the dark ever again. 2 hours later, the oppressive heat of the city gave way to the cool, air-conditioned sanctuary of the International Departure Terminal. We bypassed the chaotic, winding security lines and walked smoothly through the priority checkpoint. I was pushing a sleek, polished cart loaded with matching hard-shell designer luggage. This was not rented luxury. It was not financed by fraudulent loans or stolen credit. It was paid for by the legitimate, untainted success of my own 2 hands. We navigated the busy concourse until we reached the frosted glass doors of the first-class departure lounge. A smiling attendant checked our boarding passes and welcomed us inside. The smell of rich espresso and fresh lilies filled the air as we settled into a quiet, plush corner. Maya's eyes widened as she took in the lavish spread of fresh fruit pastries and comfortable leather seating. We sat by the expansive glass windows, watching the massive commercial jets taxi into position. This was not a frantic midnight escape from federal indictments. This was a real, uninterrupted 2-week vacation to Paris. I had promised Maya she would see the Eiffel Tower sparkle at night, eat warm croissants by the Seine, and visit the Louvre. I always kept my promises to her. As we sat there waiting for our gate to be called, Maya unzipped her small, brightly colored backpack. She dug past her new coloring books and crayons and pulled out a piece of construction paper. She smoothed it out on the glass table between us with intense, careful concentration. I looked down at the drawing. It was a beautiful, colorful explosion of crayon and marker. It depicted 2 stick figures, one tall and one small, holding hands with massive, bright smiles on their faces. Behind the figures stood a towering gray rectangle, covered in neat rows of square blue windows. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact architectural rendering of my urban planning firm's downtown office building, right down to the green trees I had planted in the courtyard. At the very top of the building, drawn in bold, unwavering red letters, was the word home. I looked at the drawing, and then I looked up at my thriving, beautiful daughter. A profound, overwhelming warmth settled in my chest, completely erasing the last lingering shadows of my family's betrayal. Vernon, Beatrice, Chloe, and Preston had orchestrated a masterclass in deception. They had viewed my loyalty as a weakness to be exploited, and my success as a resource to be plundered. They had actively tried to bury me beneath a mountain of crushing debt, public shame, and psychological gaslighting. They expected me to crumble, to surrender my hard-earned life so they could maintain their fragile aristocratic illusions. They had dug a grave and demanded I lie down in it. I smiled, reaching across the table to gently squeeze Maya's hand. They tried to bury me with debt shame and gaslighting, but they severely underestimated the foundation I was built on. Instead of suffocating in the dirt, they shoveled over me. I bought the cemetery, paved it over with concrete, and built a kingdom on top of it. This story proves that your true value is never determined by those who refuse to see it. While family may attempt to define you by their expectations or past failures, you possess the power to build a life of genuine success and independence. Resilience is the ultimate reclamation. When you stop seeking approval and start honoring your own vision, you transform pain into a foundation for your own kingdom. You are the architect of your own worth, and those who underestimated you will eventually have to watch you thrive on your own terms. Have you ever had to choose yourself when family wouldn't make space for you? Share your journey in the comments below.